Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you were watching from. The autumn wind cut through Cedar Bluff like a blade through worn leather. Dust spiraled down the main street, brushing against storefronts with cracked windows and faded paint. Horses tied outside the saloon stamped their hooves against the packed earth, sensing something the townspeople had not yet noticed. Ayanna stepped into this place with the last of her strength. 21 days since the night that took everything. 21 days of walking through brush and hostile territory, hiding from riders in shallow creeks, sleeping in ditches with one eye open, running until her legs gave out, then forcing herself to run again. Her deerskin dress hung in tatters. The beads that once decorated the neckline were scattered somewhere along the trail behind her, lost like everything else. Her arms bore purple bruises from stones thrown in other towns. Her ribs ached with each breath. She wanted only water. Perhaps a scrap of bread if someone showed mercy. Then she would leave. She always left before they could hurt her worse. But Cedar Bluff would not let her pass quietly. A boy near the blacksmith shop spotted her first. His eyes went wide as dinner plates. His fingers shot up, pointing like a rifle barrel. Monster! Apache monster! The word struck harder than any stone ever could. She had heard it in every town, from every face that looked at her and saw not a 19-year-old girl who had lost her entire world, but a threat to be destroyed. Ayanna froze. Her legs trembled beneath her. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. More faces turned. More voices joined the growing chorus. What's she doing here? Thief! She's come to steal. Get her out of our town! The first stone caught her shoulder before she could raise her hands. The impact spun her sideways. The second hit her leg, buckling her knee against the hard ground. She stumbled forward, caught herself against a hitching post, and then a third stone opened a gash above her left eyebrow. Blood ran into her eye. The world blurred red and gray. She fell. The packed dirt of the street pressed cold against her cheek. Above her, shadows gathered in a tightening circle. Men with weathered faces. Women clutching their children close. Even boys no older than 10, their arms cocked back with stones ready to fly. Their faces twisted with fear and hatred for something they did not understand. Something they did not want to understand. Finish it. Drive her out. Kill the savage before she kills us. Ayanna curled into herself, arms wrapped around her head, knees drawn to her chest. She had survived the massacre that slaughtered her entire tribe. She had walked 21 days through wilderness that should have killed her 3 times over. And now she would die here, in the dirt, beaten to death by people who had never spoken a single word to her. She squeezed her eyes shut and waited for the blow that would end everything. It never came. The footsteps sounded different from all the others. Steady, deliberate, heavy boots striking packed earth with purpose, moving through the chaos like a ship cutting through rough water. The crowd noticed before Ayanna did. Voices faltered mid-shout, arms lowered, stones dropped forgotten to the ground.
Enough.
Jedediah Calder walked into the
Get out of
circle
the way.
a man might walk into his own
This
barn
girl
after
is
a
a
long
thief.
day's work. No hurry, no hesitation. Just the calm, measured stride of someone who had already made his decision and would not be moved from it by cutter man. He was 36 years old, with a face weathered by decades of sun and wind and war. His right leg carried a slight stiffness, a souvenir from the bullet that had torn through his thigh at Gettysburg 20 years past. His dark wool coat hung open despite the autumn chill, and the Colt revolver holstered at his hip caught the pale afternoon light. Everyone in Cedar Bluff knew Jed Calder, the man who lived alone in that cabin 3 miles outside of town. The man who came in once a month for supplies, spoke to no one beyond what business required, and never once smiled at a living soul. The man who had hunted outlaws for bounty money in the years after the war, before something changed him. Before he'd stopped hunting men and started raising cattle in silence, they knew him, they feared him, and they stepped back. Jed stopped between Ayanna and the crowd. He did not draw his weapon. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, his broad back forming a wall between the bleeding woman and her attackers, his pale eyes moving slowly across the faces before him. That's enough. 2 words, spoken low and flat, without heat or threat, but they cut through the noise like a knife through soft butter. Deputy Harlan Briggs shouldered his way to the front of the mob. 31 years old, with the swagger of a man who enjoyed his small authority far too much. His hand rested on the butt of his pistol as he planted himself before Jed. "Step aside, Calder. This Apache is a thief. Stole goods from Mr. Virgil Cade's store not 2 hours past." Jed did not move, did not blink. "I don't see her carrying anything. She hid it somewhere. You know how these people are. Sneaky, dangerous. Can't trust a single one of them." Something flickered behind Jed's eyes. Something cold and hard and very, very old. "I know how they are," he said quietly. "I also know when a man is lying through his teeth." Harlan's face flushed red beneath his stubble. "You're making a powerful mistake here, Calder." "Wouldn't be my first." Jed turned his back on the deputy, a gesture of pure contempt that made Harlan's hand twitch toward his gun. But the deputy thought better of it. Even a fool knew better than to draw on Jed Calder. Jed crouched beside Ayanna. His movements were slow and deliberate, giving her time to see him coming, giving her the choice to pull away if she wanted. Blood covered half her face. Her body shook like a leaf in a storm. But her eyes, dark as creek water and fierce despite the terror, watched him with the wariness of a wounded wolf. "Can you stand?" She did not answer. She did not know how to answer a question like that from a stranger who had just saved her life. Jed slid one arm beneath her shoulders, the other beneath her knees. He lifted her as gently as he had ever lifted anything, more gently than he handled newborn calves, more carefully than he carried water to his garden in the dry season. She gasped, not from pain, but from the shock of being touched without violence. "What in blazes do you think you're doing?" Harlan demanded. Jed began walking. He did not look back. "Calder, you cannot just take her. There will be consequences." But Jed kept walking, past the frozen crowd with their forgotten stones, past the storefronts with their staring faces pressed against dusty windows, past the edge of town where the buildings ended and the open land stretched toward the
You're
mountains.
injured, just rest.
Ayana's mind
I won't come
spun
near
with
you if you
questions
don't
she
want
was
me to.
too exhausted to ask.
Why are you helping
Who was
me?
this man? What did he want from her? Why would anyone risk himself for a stranger everyone else wanted dead? But exhaustion pulled her deeper into his arms, and the steady rhythm of his boots against the earth kept her from shattering into pieces. She did not know if she was safe. She did not know if safety even existed anymore. But she was not alone, and after 21 days of running, that was enough. The cabin sat 3 miles from town, tucked between rolling fields of dry grass and a sparse stand of pine trees. Small but solid, built by hands that knew their craft, with smoke curling from the stone chimney in a thin gray ribbon. Jed carried her through the door and laid her on the only bed in the single room. The moment her back touched the wool blanket, every muscle in her body went rigid. Her arms drew tight against her chest. Her eyes darted to every corner, cataloging exits and threats with the instinct of someone who had learned that survival meant never stopping, never resting, never trusting. Door, closed but not locked. Window above the table, large enough to squeeze through. The man, standing 6 feet away, watching her. Jed recognized the fear in her eyes. He had seen that same look in the faces of horses after hard chases, in wounded soldiers lying in field hospitals, waiting to see if the surgeon would take their leg. In his own reflection, daring back from still water in the months after Eliza died. Fear that came not from a single moment, but from weeks or months or years of running from something that never stopped pursuing. He stepped backward, one pace, two, three, until his shoulders pressed against the far wall of the cabin, as far from her as the small space allowed. "You're hurt," he said, keeping his voice low and even. "You need rest. I won't come any closer unless you ask me to." She said nothing. Her eyes never left him. Jed moved to the cast iron stove in the corner, making each motion slow and visible. He lifted the lid, checked the banked coals, added a small piece of split pine. He filled the kettle from the water bucket and set it to heat, careful not to let the metal clang against the stovetop. Every movement deliberate, every action announced before he made it. When he reached for a clean cloth from the shelf near the bed, her breath caught audibly in her throat. He stopped immediately, waited 3 heartbeats, then slowly straightened and placed the cloth in a bowl of water on the small table beside her, within her reach, but not forced upon her. "For the blood on your face," he said, "when you're ready." He took a wool blanket from the chest at the foot of the bed and carried it to the opposite side of the room. Without another word, he spread it on the floor near the stove, lowered himself onto it, and turned his back to her. "I'll sleep here," he said to the wall. "You take the bed tonight and every night until you're healed enough to decide what you want to do next." Ayanna watched him for hours. She expected him to roll over, to change his mind, to push himself up in the darkness when he thought she had fallen asleep and move towards her with intentions she knew too well from the cruelty of the world. But he lay motionless on the hard floor. His breathing stayed steady and even. His body did not shift toward her even once. The distance he maintained made no sense to her. She had encountered men who offered help only to demand payment later. Men whose kindness was a trap waiting to spring shut. She did not know what this one wanted. But the longer she watched his still form, the slower her racing heart became. The quieter the screaming fear in her head grew. Outside, wind brushed against the cabin walls like fingers testing a locked door. Inside, the stove kept the air warm and close. Somewhere in the small hours before dawn, Ayanna finally closed her eyes. She slept without nightmares for the first time since the massacre. 4 days passed in a rhythm that repeated without need for words. Jed rose before first light every morning. He fed the stove quietly, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside to tend his small herd of cattle or check his trap lines along the creek.
Look at these
He
marks.
made
Someone
certain he
passed
was
by
gone
not
from the
long ago.
cabin before she woke,
I learn
giving her
quickly
space to
because I
breathe,
don't want
to
to be found
move,
by others
to
again.
exist without being watched. Ayanna observed everything. The way he left food on the rough-hewn table but never handed it to her directly. The way he knocked twice on his own cabin door before entering, even though it was his home and she was a stranger. The way he always sat in the chair farthest from the bed when they shared the same space, keeping the full width of the room between them. On the third morning, she woke earlier than usual and watched him through the small window. He stood in the gray dawn light, splitting firewood with powerful, controlled swings of his axe. Then he stopped suddenly, the axe head buried in a stump, and pressed his palm against his right thigh. His face tightened with pain he thought no one could see, but the cold made it worse. She understood that kind of wound, the kind that ached when the weather turned, that reminded you every day of the moment that created it. She carried her own invisible scars that hurt when the wind blew from the north. That evening, when he set a bowl of venison stew on the table and turned to leave her in peace, she spoke her first word to him. "Thank you." Soft as a breath, barely louder than the crackle of the fire. Jed paused. He did not turn around fully, but his head inclined slightly toward her. He nodded once. Then he moved to his corner of the room and began mending a tear in his work gloves, giving her the silence she needed to eat without being observed. It was such a small thing, a single word, a single nod. But something shifted in the cabin that night. The air felt less like a held breath. On the fifth morning, he surprised her. "You feel strong enough to walk a bit?" She looked up from the bed where she sat wrapped in one of his wool blankets. He stood by the door, a canvas sack over one shoulder, not quite meeting her eyes. Going outside meant exposure, danger, the possibility of being seen by someone who might report back to the men hunting her. But staying inside these four walls meant feeling like a prisoner, and she had spent too many days as prey to willingly become a captive. She rose to her feet. They walked through fields of dry autumn grass, through stands of pine trees that whispered in the cold breeze, down to the creek where Jed had set his snares. He showed her how to check a trap without startling a caught animal into panic, how to release the trigger mechanism safely, how to read the language of tracks pressed into mud and frost. He spoke rarely, but each word carried weight. He was not lecturing her from above. He was sharing knowledge between equals, teaching her skills that could save her life if she ever had to survive alone again. On the walk back to the cabin, her shoulder brushed against his arm as they both stepped around a fallen log at the same moment. She flinched automatically, her body bracing for violence that did not come. Jed simply shifted his weight, giving her more space on the narrow trail. No reaction, no irritation, no taking offense, just quiet awareness of her fear and the choice to accommodate it without comment. She studied him from the corner of her eye as they walked. This man moved through the world differently than any she had known. On the sixth morning, Ayanna discovered who Jedediah Calder used to be. She was sweeping the cabin floor, a task she had taken upon herself because doing nothing made her feel like a burden. When the straw broom knocked against something beneath his bed, a wooden box, rough-hewn but carefully made, pushed back against the wall where it would not be easily seen. She hesitated, then knelt and pulled it into the light. Inside, she found a tarnished military medal engraved with an eagle and the words, "For Valor." A heavy revolver, older than the one he wore, its grip worn smooth from years of use. A folded letter,
leave.
yellowed with
I don't want to bring
age,
danger
the
here.
paper soft as
No.
cloth from being read
I won't
too many
abandon
times.
others to the wolves.
The letter was signed at the bottom in faded ink. Forever yours, Eliza, 1864. And beneath everything else, wrapped in a piece of clean muslin, lay a woman's handkerchief, small and delicate, embroidered with tiny lavender flowers in thread that had once been purple but had faded to gray. The cabin door swung open. Jed stood on the threshold, an armload of firewood in his arms. His eyes found the handkerchief in her hands. He did not shout. He did not move toward her with anger. He simply stood there, looking at that small square of fabric as if she held his still-beating heart in her palm. "Eliza," he said after a long silence, "my wife. Fever took her in '65. I was still fighting in Virginia when she passed. By the time the letter reached me telling me she was sick, she had already been in the ground 3 weeks." Ayanna set the handkerchief down with careful reverence. "I am sorry, I should not have looked. You did nothing wrong. A man shouldn't keep secrets from someone living under his roof." She looked up at him, at the pain carved into the lines around his eyes, at the weight he carried in the set of his shoulders. "You have been alone a long time," she said quietly. 14 years. That is a long time to carry grief by yourself." His jaw tightened. But he did not look away from her. "I reckon it is." Something unspoken passed between them in that moment. Recognition, understanding. Two people who had lost everything, still breathing without quite knowing why. That afternoon, the sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the fragile peace. Jed stepped onto the porch, one hand resting casually near the Colt on his hip. Deputy Harlan Briggs rode up the trail with 4 men flanking him. Rough-looking characters in dusty coats, each one armed with a rifle or scattergun. "Calder." Harlan swung down from his horse with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. "Mr. Virgil Cade requests the pleasure of a conversation. About that Apache woman you're harboring. She has a name? She's a witness." Harlan's smirk widened into something ugly. She saw things she shouldn't have seen out at Black Ridge Mine, things that could cause considerable trouble for some important men. Mr. Cade would prefer she remain silent. Blackridge. Jed had heard the rumors. A mining operation 2 days ride east, where there had been some kind of accident last week. Fire, people said. No survivors. But there were always survivors. Someone always escaped to tell the truth. His eyes dropped to Harlan's right hand, where a silver ring caught the afternoon light. The band was engraved with initials. MC, a woman's ring. Too small for a man's thick finger. Jed had seen a ring like that once, on the hand of Mary Collins, a miner's wife who lived near Black Ridge with her husband and 2 young sons. Harlan could not have that ring unless he had taken it from a corpse. Tell Cade, Jed said, his voice flat as a frozen lake, that if he wants her, he'll need to walk through me to get her. Harlan studied him for a long moment. Then he laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. You just signed your own death warrant, Calder, for a savage. I hope she was worth it. The riders turned their horses and headed back toward town, dust rising behind them like smoke from a distant fire. Jed watched until they disappeared over the ridge. Then he stepped back inside where Ayanna stood in the shadows with her back pressed against the wall and her eyes wide with terror. They're gone, he said, for now. They will come back. I know. She drew a shaking breath. I should leave. I brought this danger to your door. If I go now, tonight you might... No. The word came out harder than he intended. He softened his voice. Whatever happened at Black Ridge, whatever you saw, those men won't stop hunting you just because you run. And I don't abandon people to wolves. Her eyes searched his face, looking for the lie, the hidden motive, the trap waiting to spring. She found nothing but weary determination. Why, she whispered, why risk your life for someone you do not know? Jed was quiet for a long moment. Because I stood by once when I should have acted, he said finally. Good men died because I hesitated. I've carried that weight for 20 years. I won't add to it now. That night, with the stove burning low and shadows dancing on the walls, Ayanna told him what happened at Black Ridge. My people lived in the valley near the mine. We had been there for generations, long before the white men came looking for gold. Virgil Cade wanted our land. He offered money first, then threats. We refused to leave. That land held the bones of our ancestors. Her voice grew distant, her eyes fixed on something far beyond the cabin walls. 3 weeks ago, Harlan came with 20 men. They attacked at night when most of our warriors were away hunting. They burned the lodges first to drive people into the open. Then they shot anyone who ran. She paused, swallowed hard. I hid beneath the floor of my grandmother's lodge. There was a gap between the boards, just wide enough to see through. I watched Cade ride into the firelight on his black horse. I heard him give the order to kill everyone, man, woman, and child. Leave no witnesses. Her hands clenched in her lap until the knuckles went white. I saw Harlan set the torch to the first lodge. I heard my mother scream. I saw my father try to shield my little brother. I watched them fall together. Tears carved silent tracks down her cheeks, but her voice did not waver. 37 people. My entire tribe. I was the only one who escaped. I ran for 21 days, hoping to reach someone who would believe me, who would bring justice. She looked at Jed with eyes that had seen too much. But there is no justice for people like me. I know that now. Jed sat motionless, the firelight carving deep shadows across his weathered face. 37 people, slaughtered for gold and land. Women, children, elders who had never raised a hand in violence. The rage that rose in his chest was old and familiar. The same rage he had felt at Gettysburg, watching good men die for the ambitions of generals who never stepped foot on the battlefield. The same rage that had driven him to hunt outlaws for years, seeking some form of justice in a world that seemed determined to deny it. "You're wrong," he said quietly. "About justice, Jemaran." Ayanna shook her head. "Cade owns the sheriff. He owns the judge. No one in Cedar Bluff will speak against him." "Then we don't seek justice in Cedar Bluff. We go to Helena, the federal court. Cade's money doesn't reach that far." "Helena's 4 days' ride. Cade has a dozen guns." Jed's jaw tightened. "Then we'd better start preparing." The next 4 days moved with urgent purpose. Jed rode into town to speak with the only man he trusted, Ezekiel Tanner, a 63-year-old doctor who had served as a field surgeon beside Jed during the war. Zeke was one of the few people alive who knew what kind of man Jed had been before grief and guilt had driven him into isolation. "Cade's got 10 or 12 guns working for him," Zeke confirmed, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey in his cramped office above the pharmacy. "He's got the sheriff in his pocket, and the judge besides. Anyone who speaks against him tends to meet with accidents." "What about the people, the regular folks?" "Scared, most of them." Zeke knocked back his drink. "But scared ain't the same as bought. You give them a chance to stand up without getting shot. Some of them might surprise you." Jed nodded slowly. "I need you to do something for me, Zeke, if things go bad. Name it. If I don't make it, get the girl to Helena. Get her in front of a federal judge. Make sure her testimony is heard." Zeke studied his old friend's face for a long moment. "You're really willing to die for this woman? An Apache you barely know?" "I'm willing to die for what's right. I stopped doing that for too long. Time I remembered who I used to be." Jed taught Ayanna to shoot. She learned quickly, her hands steady, her eyes sharp, her focus absolute. The skills her father had taught her with bow and arrow translated naturally to the revolver Jed placed in her palm. "You're a natural," he told her after she put 3 rounds into a fence post from 30 yards. "My father said I had a warrior's heart. He meant it as a compliment." He was right. On the 9th day, unexpected help arrived. Martha Colby rode up to the cabin just before sunset. She was 59 years old, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that had seen more sorrow than any woman deserved. She ran the general store in Cedar Bluff, a widow who had buried her husband 10 years past and never remarried. "Cade's planning to move against you tomorrow night," she said without preamble. 8 men. They'll burn the cabin and kill you both, then blame it on Apache raiders seeking revenge. That's the story they'll tell anyway. Jed's expression hardened. "How do you know this?" "Because I'm not as deaf as people think, and Harlan Briggs talks too loud when he's drinking." Martha's gaze shifted to Ayanna. "I know who you are. I know what happened at Black Ridge." Ayanna stiffened. "Why would you help us?" Martha was silent for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was rough with old grief. "My daughter Sarah married a Cheyenne man named Walking Bear. Good man. Treated her like a queen. They had a little girl together, my only grandchild. Last spring, Cade's men killed all 3 of them. Called it a justified action against hostile Indians. My Sarah wasn't hostile. She was just a mother trying to protect her baby." She straightened her spine, her eyes blazing. "I couldn't save my daughter, but maybe I can help save you." They came at midnight, just as Martha had warned. 8 shadows moving through the darkness toward the cabin from 3 directions. Torches flickered in their hands, ready to set the whole world ablaze. But Jed was not inside waiting to be burned alive. He lay flat on the roof of his horse barn, 50 yards from the cabin, the Winchester rifle he had not touched in years pressed against his shoulder. The moon provided just enough light to see by, painting the approaching figures in shades of silver and black. Ayanna crouched behind the water trough near the cabin's west wall. The Colt revolver Jed had given her gripped tight in both hands. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but her breathing stayed controlled. Steady, she was done being prey. The first shot split the night like a crack of thunder. Jed's bullet took the lead rider out of his saddle before the man even knew death was coming. The body hit the ground with a heavy thump, and suddenly chaos erupted. Shouts, curses, horses screaming as their riders tried to control them. Two men sprinted toward the barn, thinking to flush out the shooter. Jed shifted his aim, exhaled slowly, and dropped them both before they covered half the distance. A fourth man came around the corner of the cabin at a dead run, torch raised high, heading straight for Ayana's position. She lifted the revolver. Her hand trembled. She fired. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt 3 feet to the left. The man spun toward her, surprise on his face, gun already rising. Ayana fired again. The bullet caught him high in the chest. He staggered, dropped his torch, and collapsed face first in the dirt. More gunfire. More shouting. The acrid smell of powder smoke filling the cold night air. When the echoes finally faded, 5 of Cade's men lay motionless on the frozen ground. 3 others had fled into the darkness, Harlan Briggs among them. Jed climbed down from the barn roof, his bad leg nearly buckling when he hit the ground. He limped toward Ayana, Winchester still in hand, scanning the shadows for any remaining threat. "You hit?" She shook her head. Her hands were trembling now that the danger had passed, but her voice stayed steady. "I killed a man." "You defended yourself. There's a difference." "Does the difference matter when you close your eyes at night?" Jed looked at her for a long moment. The question deserved an honest answer. "No," he said quietly. "It doesn't. You'll carry that face with you forever. But you're alive to carry it. That's what matters." The next morning, Jed did not run. He did not hide. He did not wait for Cade to regroup and come at him with more men. He rode straight into Cedar Bluff. Virgil Cade stood on the boardwalk outside his store, Harlan Briggs beside him with a bandage wrapped around his arm, where a splinter of wood had caught him during the firefight. A crowd gathered in the street, the same crowd that had thrown stones at Ayana 12 days earlier. "Calder!" Cade's voice rang out across the morning air. "You murdered 5 of my men last night. That's a hanging offense." Jed reined his horse to a stop in the middle of the street. His voice carried to every ear. "They attacked my home in the middle of the night. That's self-defense by any law." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "But since we're talking about murder, let's talk about Black Ridge Mine. 37 people slaughtered so you could steal their land. Men, women, children, all dead because you wanted their gold." Whispers rippled through the crowd. They had heard rumors about Black Ridge. Everyone had, but no one had dared speak the words aloud. "You have no proof," Cade sneered. "Just the ravings of a savage who—" A second horse emerged from the alley behind Jed. Ayana sat tall in the saddle, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on Virgil Cade with the fierce intensity of a woman who had nothing left to lose. "I am the proof." Her voice rang clear and strong across the silent street. "I hid beneath the floor of my grandmother's lodge. I watched you ride into our village on your black horse. I heard you give the order to kill everyone. I saw Harlan Briggs set the first torch. I saw my mother die. I saw my father fall, trying to protect my baby brother." She pointed directly at Cade. "I will testify before the federal court in Helena. I will tell them everything I saw. And then you will hang for what you did." Harlan's hand moved toward his gun. A rifle barrel appeared over the railing of the pharmacy balcony. Zeke Tanner's weathered face appeared behind it. "I wouldn't," the old doctor called down. "I can shoot the eye out of a squirrel at this distance. Your eye's a bigger target." Cade's face had gone pale as milk. His eyes darted around the crowd, looking for the support he had always counted on. But something had changed. The people were not looking at Ayana with hatred anymore. They were looking at Cade, at the man who had told them the Apache were dangerous, were thieves, were monsters. The man who had used their fear to cover his own monstrous crimes. Martha Colby stepped out of the crowd, her voice ringing clear. I'll take this girl to Helena myself. I'll testify that Cade's men attacked Jed Calder's home without provocation. And I'll tell them what happened to my daughter and her family. She turned to face the gathered townspeople. Who else has lost someone to Cade's accidents? Who else has been too scared to speak? This is your chance. Stand up now or live with your silence forever. For a long moment, no one moved. Then a man near the back of the crowd stepped forward, a miner who had worked at Black Ridge before it burned. I'll speak. Another man joined him, then a woman, then three more. Cade tried to run. He made it 3 steps before Zeke's rifle cracked. The bullet took him in the leg. Not fatal, but enough to drop him, screaming to the boardwalk. 2 men from the crowd seized his arms before he could rise. For the first time in his life, Virgil Cade felt the cold iron of handcuffs close around his wrists. 2 weeks later, in the federal courthouse in Helena, Ayanna took the witness stand. The courtroom was packed to the walls. Miners who had worked at Black Ridge, merchants who had heard rumors, families who had lost someone and never known why, journalists from newspapers as far away as San Francisco, drawn by the story of a lone Apache woman taking on one of Montana's richest men. The prosecutor asked her to describe what she had witnessed. Ayanna did not look at Cade sitting in chains at the defendant's table. She looked at the jury, 12 men who had never spoken to an Apache woman before, who had been taught their whole lives to fear and despise her people. I was 19 years old when they came for us, she said. I had never hurt anyone in my life. Neither had my mother, who made beautiful beadwork that she traded at the fort. Neither had my father, who taught me to track deer and honor the land. Neither had my baby brother, who was only 4 years old and afraid of the dark. Her voice did not waver. I watched them all die. I hid in the darkness and listened to their screams. And I survived because someone had to. Someone had to tell the truth. She raised her hand and pointed at Virgil Cade. That man gave the order. That man murdered 37 people for gold. And I will carry their voices with me until the day I die. The jury deliberated for 47 minutes. Guilty on all counts. Virgil Cade was sentenced to hang. Harlan Briggs received life imprisonment at hard labor in the territorial prison. Justice. Slow and imperfect, but real. Jed waited outside the courthouse when the verdict was announced. He leaned against a wooden post in the afternoon sun, his bad legs stretched out before him, his eyes fixed on the mountains in the distance. He had not gone inside for the trial. He did not need to hear the details again. He already knew what men were capable of doing to each other. Ayanna found him there after the crowds had dispersed. It's over, she said. It's over, he agreed. They stood in silence for a while, letting the weight of the words settle between them. I can go anywhere now, Ayanna said finally. No one is hunting me anymore. I could go east, find other survivors from other tribes, start again somewhere far from here. Jed nodded slowly. The thought of her leaving opened an ache in his chest that surprised him with its depth. You could do that, he said. You've earned the right to choose your own path. She turned to look at him, at his weathered face and tired eyes, at the man who had stepped between her and a mob without hesitation, who had slept on a hard floor for weeks to give her peace, who had fought beside her and never once asked for anything in return. I could go anywhere, she said again, but I find myself wanting to stay. Jed's breath caught. He turned to face her fully. This life isn't easy, he said quietly. The winters are hard. The work never ends. And there are still plenty of people who will hate you just for being who you are. I have survived worse. You have. She took a step closer to him. Jedediah Calder, are you asking me to stay, or are you trying to talk me out of it? A ghost of a smile crossed his face, the first smile she had ever seen from him. I suppose I'm asking. Then I suppose I'm accepting. 1 month later, the cabin looked the same from the outside, small, solid, smoke rising from the chimney. But everything had changed. Ayanna split firewood in the yard, her swing strong and sure, her breath misting in the cold December air. Jed worked on the fence around the horse corral, his movements slower than hers because of his leg, but steady and patient. Two cups sat on the table inside. Two pairs of boots rested beside the door. Two coats hung on the pegs by the entrance. There had been no wedding ceremony. Neither of them believed in such things, and no church in the territory would have married them anyway. But they had made their vows in their own way, in actions rather than words, in the choice to stay when leaving would have been easier, in the choice to build when destruction was all around them. Jed had spent 14 years believing he did not deserve happiness, that the man who had failed to save his wife had no right to love again, that his guilt was a life sentence he had to serve alone. But standing on that porch in the evening light, watching Ayanna brush wood chips from her dress and smile at something one of the horses did, he understood something that had eluded him for more than a decade. Eliza would not have wanted him to die slowly in silence. She had loved his strength, his courage, his willingness to fight for what was right. She would have wanted him to use those things, not bury them beneath years of regret. She would have wanted him to live. He was finally ready to honor that wish. The sun set behind the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that looked like fire but promised only peace. Ayanna joined him on the porch, accepting the cup of coffee he held out to her. They stood side by side, shoulders almost touching, watching the light fade from the world. "Good day," she said. "Good day," he agreed. Nothing more needed to be said. They had both learned that survival was not about the absence of pain. The scars they carried would never fully heal. Jed still woke some nights reaching for a wife who had been gone for 14 years. Ayanna still flinched at sudden loud noises, still saw flames behind her eyes when sleep took too long to come. But they no longer carried those wounds alone. And standing there together, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky, they both understood the truth that had brought them to this place. Some people are broken by the world's cruelty, others are forged by it, and the rarest few find someone willing to stand beside them in the fire, not to save them from the flames, but to help them walk through and emerge on the other side. Jedediah Calder and Ayanna had found that in each other. Two people who had lost everything. Two people who had been given a second chance. Two people who had chosen, against all odds, against all reason, to face the future together. The night settled over the Montana territory, cold and clear and full of stars. Inside the cabin, the stove burned warm and steady, and two cups sat side by side on the table waiting for morning. The end. If this story moved you, leave a comment and let us know. And don't forget to subscribe for more tales of the Old West, where justice was hard-won, courage was tested, and second chances were earned through blood and fire.
The story offers a profound lesson about courage and timely kindness. When a crowd is driven by fear, they easily turn violent and cruel towards the innocent. But if just one person dares to stand up, dares to say, "Enough," evil will no longer easily prevail. The male protagonist doesn't save the female protagonist with grand promises, but with small actions, maintaining distance, respecting, protecting, and giving her a chance to stand on her own 2 feet. The female protagonist also demonstrates the strength of a survivor. Pain can still be transformed into willpower, and loss into the voice of truth. Ultimately, justice may be slow and imperfect, but it will come when people unite and do not remain silent in the face of wrongdoing.